Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about Gothic Europe and also late medieval Italy, which could be called the very early Renaissance, but we'll talk more about that in a second. So first off, who are the Goths and why is it called Gothic? So I have a little visual on the bottom to get you thinking on the right path. Not that kind of Gothic. The Goths that we're talking about is a term that's derived from the names of Northern European barbaric tribes, such as the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. These were all barbaric people that were enemies of the Roman Empire, so the Romans used the relatively derogative term Goth to describe them. The Goths, in general, were warfaring and violent people. So in time, the term Goth was used to describe anything that was seen as monstrous and barbarous. Art historians of the Renaissance thought that the artwork of this time period was so ugly, so they called it Gothic artwork. In retrospect, I'd like to argue that Gothic artwork isn't ugly. I really like Gothic artwork. I think it's beautiful. So Gothic art describes late medieval art and architecture in Europe, specifically France, England, and what was then the Holy Roman Empire. During this time period, many cathedrals were built out of stone. This here is generally accepted to be the first example of a Gothic cathedral. This is in France, and it was dedicated to Saint Denis, who was a saint who got his head chopped off, so there's a sculpture of him holding his head in here. And it was visited by a lot of pilgrims. You can see that it's very large, it's made of stone, and there's a certain kind of elongation to the architecture, which allowed for a lot of really beautiful stained glass. That's especially true of Chartres Cathedral, and Chartres is perhaps the most famous Gothic cathedral. It was rebuilt in 1194 because the original was burnt down, but it was rebuilt in the original style. You can see that that green roof was probably copper, bright copper when it was first built, or it certainly was bright copper. And you can see even today that this structure towers over all of the buildings that surround it. The pilgrims that would have traveled to Chartres in the 1100s and the 1200s, this would perhaps be the tallest building that they would ever see in their lives. It was one of the tallest buildings in all of Europe when it was built. And inside, it was believed to house Saint Mary's mantle, and Mary was believed to have worn a mantle, which is a type of cloak. You can see that there are very elaborate flying buttresses that support the massive stone architecture of this building, and all of that reinforcement allowed architects to include fabulous stained glass within this church. Here you have a sense of what it would be like to step into the space. Remember that a lot of the people who would have visited these churches were also illiterate, so the stained glass would be one of the only clues, visual clues they would have to understanding the scripture. This here is the rose window of Chartres. Chartres is also fairly unique because a lot of the stained glass in other cathedrals was destroyed during World War II, but the stained glass in Chartres is almost entirely original. Here you can see its splendor and glory, and one thing that makes the stained glass of this time period different from a lot of stained glass today is that the pigments were actually suspended inside of the glass itself. This glass wasn't painted, it was actually made, all of these different colors that you see here. Wait, one other thing I want to say about stained glass. It was believed that the pure light of the sun was supposed to be a visual image of the revelation of God. So to have the light of the sun streaming through the beautifully stained glass of the church would have been a semi-religious experience for the people that were sitting and marveling at it. in much the same way that all experience is religious, but it is the ideal of the church to try and help everybody to experience it. So this stained glass was also meant to represent the idea of the church, but through art in a visual form. Now let's go further south. Let's go to Italy. We were in France. Italy around 1400. Here we have a breakup of different kingdoms that it was broken into. So keep in mind that today we think of the countries of Italy as being fairly united, but during this time period, each one of these different regions would have been, except for the language, very culturally different one from the other. One thing that they all experienced, though, was in 14th century, the Black Death. So the Black Death, which is also known as the bubonic plague, is a common form of plague in humans. It still exists today, although now we can treat it. It's carried by rodents, specifically rats, usually, and it's transmitted through flea bites. So a flea will bite a rat and then bite a human. The disease is characterized by fever, delirium, and the formation of buboes, which is where the name bubonic plague originates. Buboes are large, swollen, circular, well, here, this is a bubo right here, and here. The bubonic plague is often fatal, and in 14th century Europe, 1 out of every 4, which is to say 75 million people, or 25% of the population, is estimated to have died of the bubonic plague. That's a very low estimate. Some historians say up to as much as 50% of the population may have died from the plague, so this is an extremely traumatic event. People didn't know how to cure the plague or even where it came from necessarily. You'll often hear it referred to as the Black Death because this blackening of external limbs is one of the effects of the plague in some people. People would often contract it and then die within 2, 3, or 4 days. And imagine seeing the people you loved most dying, oftentimes violently, having blood coming out of all of their orifices, knowing there was nothing you could do. And the dead were piling up in the streets. As a result of this, we see a lot of artwork that had death as its subject. Some written accounts of the plague exist. Here, for example, is an excerpt of the writing, specifically the journal, of a man named Agnolo di Turo del Grasso, that means the fat, who was an Italian author of the late 1300s. Here's what he has to say. People began to die in Siena in May 1348. It was a cruel and horrible thing. I do not know where to begin to tell of the cruelty and horror of it. Survivors were so distraught that they were almost without feeling. Victims died almost at once. People would swell up in their armpits and their groins. Fathers abandoned children, wives, husbands, brothers, and sisters. No one could be found to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug in Siena and were piled deep with the dead. They died by the hundreds, day and night. I, Agnolo di Turo, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. I can barely imagine what that would have been like. Here is a slide with 2 images from a fresco called The Triumph of Death, which took death as its subject, as did a lot of artwork that we see coming out of this time period. And you can see a well-dressed hunting party of noble people, and they've been led by their dogs. They've got hunting dogs down here who are following the trail of what I guess they were assuming was wild game, but it leads them instead to the coffins of the dead. What does this mean? It means that death itself is the great equalizer. And it waits not only for the poor, but for the rich as well. This horrible event of the plague forced people to reevaluate life itself. And although some people turned to religion as a result of the plague, it didn't obviously do much to improve their daily lives. Some claimed that God had sent the plague as a punishment for people's sinfulness, but a lot of people simply came to see it as a horrible natural event, and we see a shift begin to take place in culture, where ideas from ancient Greece and Rome are being revived and brought back into artistic practice as a result of this terrible event. So the Renaissance is a term you've probably heard before. The Renaissance is the cultural rebirth that occurred in Europe from roughly the 14th through the middle of the 17th centuries, based on the rediscovery of the literature of Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome. Examples of high Renaissance art and architecture are the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, which I'm sure you've been exposed to before. And here we have St. Peter's, as designed by many people, but most notably Michelangelo. And no, we're not going to study these things in this class. All of that is covered by Survey 2. But what we're studying right now is called the Proto-Renaissance, which is the period directly before this and that leads into the Renaissance itself. The Proto-Renaissance is just the pre-Renaissance, or the very early Renaissance. Proto is a word in Greek that means first half. What characterizes the Renaissance? In one word, we could say humanism. And humanism is a philosophy and a cultural movement that turned away from medieval scholasticism and religious thought, and it revived an interest in ancient Greek and Roman thought. Humanist beliefs emphasize knowledge and education instead of blind faith, earthly fame instead of divine sainthood, and rational ways of solving human problems. So we see a turn away from the stylization and the flatness and the very religious nature of Gothic and medieval artwork, stuff like this. This is some stained glass from Chartres. And back to stuff like this. This is Critias' Boy from ancient Greece, which was a sculpture that very much sought to attain the ideal and perfection in a close study of the natural human form. I include this artwork here not because it necessarily displays the Renaissance, but because it is a perfect example of what the Proto-Renaissance moves away from. This is an altarpiece, and it's fairly large. If you look at it, it's almost life-size, the figure is, but the figure itself is very much not lifelike. You can see a profound flattening of all of the figures and of the background itself. Everything is very static. We have an image of this saint, and this image was meant to be used in religious contemplation and prayer, and he's flanked by different scenes of his life that reinforce his divinity and that are very didactic, so they very much tell a religious story that the viewer is expected to blindly believe. The flat background was covered in gold, which reinforces the flatness of the image and just reflects back the light of the candles. So it's not trying to be anything other than what it is, a flat image that's meant to make you dream about the divine. This was made in 1235. It's incredible when you look at this image and then look at artwork that's made a century after it, and then a century after it. You see what an incredible leap there was in the artistic output and the philosophical thought during this time. So moving slightly forward in time, we see two other altarpieces. The one on the left, although still very flat, if you were to zoom in closer, you'd see incredible detail in the faces and indeed in the emotional life of the figures. For example, you'll see that, maybe I can zoom in. Anyway, you see that the angel here who's come to Mary with the announcement that she'll be giving birth to a child that is divine is delivering his message, but Mary looks a little bit less than super excited about it. She seems to be having some second thoughts, and this introduction of human emotion into art shows the beginning of the Renaissance. Also, in this other altarpiece, we see more interest not only in figures, interactions, and emotional states, but also in a representation, quote unquote, true representation of a physical space, with the artist's interest in developing ways of showing perspective, so showing a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane. You've heard this term before, fresco. Fresco is a very old way of working, used all the way back in the Aegean. That bull leaping fresco was a fresco. But just going a little bit further into the term, you'll hear fresco secco as opposed to buon fresco. So fresco secco is painting directly onto dry plaster, which is what this guy is doing down here. That's not considered true fresco, because when you paint on dry fresco, dry plaster, the paint sits on the surface of the plaster, so it's not as durable. Whereas with buon fresco, you paint onto the plaster while the plaster is still wet. So this is what wet plaster looks like. And you have to paint onto it before it dries so that it absorbs the paint evenly. It's hard to do correctly. And over time, especially with the addition of humidity or excessive dryness, it can start to deteriorate. Here you can see some lines, and these lines are caused by the different areas of wet plaster being applied. So in this case, this painting was worked on piece by piece. So this piece of plaster was applied first, and once it was dry, the second piece was applied first to allow for enough time to carefully render all of these figures. This is just an explanation of process so that when you look at the artwork you can understand it better. So this here is the arena chapel in its entirety, and you can see that every area of the chapel has been decorated by this artist who is commonly known as Giotto, or Giotto de Bondone is his full name. Giotto was hired by the Scroveni family to paint the entire interior of this chapel, and they allowed him room and board for as long as it took for him to paint this chapel as beautifully as possible. The work that he did in there is commonly accepted as the first quote-unquote Renaissance paintings. And you see in it, it's a total revolution in visual representation. This was made 70 years after that St. Francis altarpiece, but look at how different it is. We see a number of figures, and they're outside in a space that's not exactly believable, but it shows evidence of an interest in perspective and composition. You can get a real sense of the emotional state of all of these figures. You can see Mary staring into the face of her son, but even above her, the angels seem to be in such a state of despair that they're losing their minds. Look at how they tear at their hair and seem to be wailing aloud. Everyone in it is very much an individual. There's an emphasis on human feeling and human experience, and when the viewer looks at it, they're almost implied within the image, because in the front here we have these two faceless figures. Their specific identity isn't as important as their emotion, and in them we can imagine any of us being placed within this scene. Final image of this lecture, I just want to talk briefly about the Florence Cathedral, which is perhaps the most important architectural innovation of this time period. The dome of this cathedral was larger than any dome that had been built since ancient Roman times. During the medieval ages, the knowledge and architectural finesse it took to build domes of this size had been lost. But Arnolfo di Cambio, among other people, sought to revive the ideals of ancient Rome and update them. Instead of using concrete, he built with brick, and was able to devise a pulley system and even had to construct a canal system in order to make this dome that was so incredibly large. It was a very famed architectural marvel in its day, and people would come from hundreds of miles around just to see this. And Florence following the construction of the dome, became one of the center places and even the heart of the Renaissance and Renaissance production, in addition to Rome. And that concludes this lecture. Thank you.